Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Traston is here this evening. I'm delighted to be joined by Stephen Kelly. Stephen is Associate Professor of Modern History at Liverpool Hope University, and he has a number of research interests, including Margaret Thatcher, British-Irish relations, and Northern Ireland. And he brought all three of these together in his recent publication entitled Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Party, and the Northern Ireland Conflict, 1975 to 1990. Stephen is currently working on another project, which is a biography of Gerard Boland. Tonight, the title of his paper is To Hell or to Connaught, Margaret Thatcher, Re-Partition and the Irish Border, 1979 to 1990. Stephen, you're very, very welcome to Traston is here.
Thank you very much, Liam, and I'm honoured to be asked to take part in the event this evening. And I'd just like to say thanks to yourself and the organising committee, and everyone else who's entered and participating this evening. I'll be quite happy to take questions after the end of my paper. And as I said to Liam, I don't think I'll speak any more than 30 minutes. So I'll get underway. So this evening, I wish to examine Margaret Thatcher's attitude to repartition and the Irish border during her period as British Prime Minister from 1979 to 1990. And what I want to kind of articulate this evening is that Thatcher's attitude to the above topics was a powerful blend of personal indifference and indeed, I would say, ignorance. Far too often, she demonstrated a certain naivety, or what Sir David Goodhart described as primitiveness, towards the prospect of repartition and more generally cross-border relations and security in particular. She was overwhelmed quite often by the complexities of the subject that confronted her. Indeed, in her memoir, which she published when she left office, called The Down Street Years, Thatcher admitted a general ignorance of Irish affairs. And this is to quote Thatcher, "But what British politician will ever fully understand Northern Ireland?" That's the end quote. And my focus of my paper this evening is to kind of examine Thatcher's occasional discussion about the prospect of repartition and the redrawing of the boundary of Northern Ireland, including, as she had herself suggested, the mass transfer of Northern Catholics to the Republic of Ireland. Now, despite being repeatedly informed by her leading civil servants and ministerial colleagues that repartition had the potential, quote, to reignite full-scale civil war in Ireland, end quote, Thatcher continued to harbour a long-held misconception that the redrawing of the boundary between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland would generally, or greatly, I should say, improve cross-border security along the border, and as a result, diminish the threat posed by Irish Republican paramilitaries. And I suppose, given the fact we're now commemorating the centenary of the foundation of the Northern Ireland State, with the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 and the establishment of the Parliament in Northern Ireland in 1921, I think it's an opportune occasion to reassess Thatcher's attitude to the Irish border. Now, what I want to kind of emphasise this evening is Thatcher was obsessed with security policy in relation to Northern Ireland, challenging much of our energy and thinking towards Northern Ireland on how to tackle parliamentary violence, chiefly Irish Republican terrorism. It is partly because of her prioritising security policy over political initiatives for Northern Ireland that she quickly gained a reputation as an inflexible militarist. Her no-surrender attitude was confirmed by a refusal to grant so-called political status during the 1981 hunger strike, during which time Body Sams and a further 9 prisoners died. And having read thousands of government departmental papers, together with analysing her personal papers, which I'll come to in a moment, it is evident that throughout Thatcher's premiership, and we shouldn't forget Thatcher was in office from 1979 to 1990, which is 3 consecutive terms, Northern Ireland, it always felt like an annoying distraction, a mere sideshow to more urgent socio-economic issues, including her obsession with reducing rampant inflation and how to temper the power of the trade unions. And in reality, as much as Thatcher had little interest in, say, the agriculture, the arts, sports and transport, Northern Ireland was not an area of party or government policy that she was naturally drawn towards. And as a result, I would argue, the subject rarely featured high on her list of political priorities, nor was it a topic that she truly ever understood. But besides those criticisms, the reality is that irrespective of Thatcher wanted Northern Ireland to the top of her political agenda, it regularly was. And that's clear by examining the cabinet minutes throughout her premiership. And I'll touch upon some of those cabinet meetings in relation to my paper. And just a little note for those who are interested, potentially about furthering their own research interest in Margaret Thatcher. I just want to draw your attention to some source material that's available and which is available actually online. So apart from engaging with relevant secondary source literature, the research on which this paper is based consists of hitherto and recently declassified primary sources from several archival institutions in Great Britain and indeed Ireland. And the notable archives that I draw your attention to will be the National Archives of the United Kingdom, which is of course based in London. You also have the Churchill Archives Centre, which is based at the University of Cambridge, the National Archives of Ireland in Dublin, and the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. And in particular, the release of declassified British government departmental files related to Thatcher's premiership under the British state's 20-year rule has permitted me today to offer what I would argue is a fresh interpretation of the subject under investigation. I should note I was quite fortunate in 2017 to be awarded a fellowship from Cambridge University, where Margaret Thatcher's papers are kept. So I spent 2 months there, and I literally day after day went through Margaret Thatcher's papers, looking for and locating documents related to Northern Ireland. And it's probably a question I can pose now and maybe answer later on. But it's one of those big questions: why did Thatcher give her papers to Cambridge when in fact she was a graduate of Oxford University? But I'll maybe leave that one out there and we can come back to it later on. If anyone is interested, as I said, in pursuing their interest in Thatcher, there is an absolutely superb online database, and it's the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. If you get an opportunity, you should Google it, the Margaret Thatcher Foundation, because they're currently in the process of digitizing every single document, both government and private, related to Margaret Thatcher's premiership. And you can go into that archive online database and you can look for a keyword search or a date related to any area of Margaret Thatcher's premiership. So it's something that I would always say is the first point to call. And also, if you're interested in any secondary works in Margaret Thatcher, apart from my own, of course, but more broadly on Thatcher and her biography of her life, Charles Moore published recently 3 volumes, which are the authorized biographies of Margaret Thatcher, and you should be able to pick up a copy relatively cheap on Amazon. So that's Charles Moore's work. But back to the paper itself. So I've subtitled the paper this evening "To Hell or to Connaught," and I'm going to place that in context over the next few minutes. Thatcher always found the Irish border and the prospect of repartition a conundrum, as she did more broadly, generally Northern Ireland. Throughout her premiership, she occasionally brought up the prospect of repartitioning Northern Ireland in what I would argue the misguided belief that this would improve the security situation, specifically cross-border security along the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. According to Charles Powell, who was Thatcher's private secretary for foreign affairs from 1983 to 1990, on one such occasion, and this is to quote Powell, she thought that if we had a straight line border, not one with all those kinks and wiggles in it, it would be easier to defend, end quote. Repeatedly, she had to be told or reminded by her somewhat baffled ministers and civil servants alike that there was, quote, no tidy dividing line between the intertwining Catholic and Protestant communities, including Belfast and Derry, Londonderry. And we'll come back to this argument time and time again over the next few minutes. Revealingly, Douglas Hurd in his memoirs specifically mentions this issue of repartition. Now, memoirs, you have to be careful because obviously they're written in retrospect and they might have a particular argument or point of view. But I think Hurd's honesty here is really revealing. And he was a senior member within Margaret Thatcher's cabinet during the 1980s. So I just thought I'd give a little bit of insight into his views, which I would argue reflected the cabinet collectively. But at the same time, something else that comes quite to the fore during my research is that for the vast majority of cabinet ministers, and indeed the Conservative Party at large, they couldn't care a hoot about Northern Ireland. It was a distraction, it was annoying, and they were quite happy to see it disappear if they could have that option. And we shouldn't forget, in the 1970s, the Labour government under Harold Wilson, not to speak about the Conservative government, did actually consider withdrawal from Northern Ireland. Thatcher herself never conceded to withdraw because she felt that it would lead to full-scale civil war. So back to Douglas Hurd for a moment. Now, he held the portfolio for Northern Ireland, or Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, from September 1984 until the September of the following year, 1985. And in his memoir, he recalled with frustration how Thatcher tended to begin, quote, from square one each time there was a meeting to consider Northern Ireland policy. And I'm quoting again from Howard here, quote, I do not know how many times she began a conversation with me by saying that the answer might be to redraw the border so as to be rid of areas which were substantially nationalist and to retain a loyal and impregnable unionist province. Now, repeatedly, Hurd wrote in his memoir, I had to tell her of the tribal map of Belfast hanging in my office at Stormont. Hurd continued, and that's the quote I have here on the PowerPoint. The map looked as if an artist had flung pots of orange and green paint haphazardly at the canvas. The intertwining of communities was hopelessly complex. The same was broadly true of Londonderry and for 4 of the 6 counties of the province. The term ethnic cleansing was not yet in vogue, but ethnic cleansing on a brutal scale would have been needed if repartition were to have an effect. Now, I want to introduce you to someone else who was very close to Margaret Thatcher at this time, a civil servant known as David Goodhart. Despite such interventions, Thatcher, again, given her single-mindedness and her steely determination and her refusal, if you like, to listen to the views of others, she refused to abandon the prospect of repartition, including the mass transfer of Northern Catholics into the Republic of Ireland. It was simply logical, Thatcher was reported as stating during a cabinet meeting in January 1984, to encourage Northern Catholics, and this is a quote from Thatcher herself, who did not wish to remain under British rule, to relocate to the Republic of Ireland. Quote Thatcher again, why could we not redraw the border to exclude predominantly Catholic areas and relieve ourselves of the expense of paying social security to people who did not want to belong to the United Kingdom anyway? And this is what she pondered out loud at a cabinet meeting. Once again, it took the forceful intervention of her civil servants to remind Thatcher that this would not solve the problem, as Catholic and Protestant communities were, quote, too intermingled in the border areas. And that's a quote taken from Sir David Goodhart, who was at the time, in the mid-80s, Deputy Under Secretary of State to the Foreign Office from 1984 to 1987. And David Goodhart is a fascinating individual. He had Irish ancestry, but up until he was appointed to the inner circle of Thatcher's kind of civil service in the mid-80s, he had never had any involvement in Northern Ireland. But nonetheless, with the exception of Robert Armstrong, who was Margaret Thatcher's cabinet secretary during this period, he became, I would argue, Thatcher's conscience in Northern Ireland. And although I wouldn't suggest that he was sympathetic to Irish unity, he certainly could understand the political motivations and partly the ideology of Irish Republicans and nationalists more broadly, something which Thatcher, of course, completely misunderstood throughout her time in office. So I just want to give you a little further insight into the views of Goodhart, because fortunately, in Churchill College, where Margaret Thatcher's papers are kept, Goodhart donated his diary, which recounts his involvement in Northern Ireland during the 1980s, including his central involvement with the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement in November of 1985. But I just point to this particular meeting. I refer again to a meeting in January of 1984, which Goodhart took a record of. So during the same conversation of January of 1984, noted above, Thatcher, who was given to historical analogies, refused to be drowned out by Goodhart's latest attempted intervention regarding repartition. And this is again a quote from Thatcher. After all, the Irish were used to large-scale movements of population. Only recently there had been a population transfer of that kind. Now, at that point, Goodhart noted that, as he said in his own memoir, the silence around the fire became transfused with simple bafflement. And after a pause, he asked whether she could be, quote, possibly thinking of Oliver Cromwell, end quote. Thatcher confirmed this to be correct. And Goodhart, to his astonishment, says, Prime Minister, quote, Cromwell's policy towards Ireland was known to Hell or to Connaught, and it left a scar in Anglo-Irish relations which still haven't healed. But Thatcher, being Thatcher, was unperturbed by Goodhart's latest intervention. Indeed, on another occasion, she compared Northern Catholics to the Germans in the Sudetenland during the 1930s. And again, we have to appreciate Thatcher's ideological standpoint, her views of the world, and instinctively, we should never forget that Thatcher at her very base was a unionist, someone who believed deeply in the United Kingdom. So at heart, Thatcher was instinctively a unionist. For this reason, she found it almost impossible to acknowledge that many Catholics in Northern Ireland felt a stronger allegiance to the Republic of Ireland rather than the United Kingdom. In Thatcher's view, Northern Ireland was British, as much so as the Falklands, as Gibraltar, as Hong Kong. Therefore, she simply couldn't fathom, or was unwilling to fathom, why many of the Catholic population in Northern Ireland rejected a British identity and nationality. Now, Thatcher's prejudices were certainly shaped by her deep detest for Irish Republican violence and her opposition to United Ireland, which threatened, in her view, to tear apart the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And we shouldn't forget, just before Thatcher was elected as Prime Minister in May of 1979, her Shadow Secretary of State, Erin Neave, was blown up in a car bomb as he left Westminster by the INLA. So she had personally, if you like, had a first-hand account of the loss of life. And within weeks of coming in as Prime Minister in August of 1979, she, of course, faced the tragedy of Lord Mountbatten and his party being brutally murdered by the IRA. And also on the same day, you had several British troops were blown up at Warren Point. So Thatcher, from the moment she becomes Prime Minister, her focus is on security. Her focus is on defeating, if possible, Irish Republican paramilitaries. And therefore, that conditions her views in Northern Ireland. But at the same time, although I haven't got time to talk about it this evening, I would argue that a metamorphosis occurs in Thatcher's ideas towards Northern Ireland. And I think that's symbolised with her signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985. But just back to the paper and this issue around Thatcher and her unionism. So consequently, throughout Thatcher's leadership of the Conservative Party, she never wavered in her commitment to maintaining Northern Ireland's constitutional position within the United Kingdom. And this is something that was reinforced when I was interviewing Sir Robert Armstrong, who recently passed, who was Margaret Thatcher's cabinet secretary. I interviewed him several years ago, and something struck me when we had the conversation. And he said to me, and I'll never forget it, he says, Stephen, you have to understand when it comes to Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland's constitutional position within the United Kingdom, Thatcher's, and this is a quote from Armstrong, Thatcher's rock was sovereignty. As much so as Thatcher was obsessed with protecting the Falklands during the Falklands War in 82, similarly, Thatcher never wavered in her commitments to maintaining Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. Irrespective of the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which did give the Irish government a consultative role, but there was never any talk of joint authority, even if the Irish government had sought that, or indeed of Britain cutting any ties with Northern Ireland. Very different, of course, than what's going on today in contemporary events. So let me get to the crux of my paper, just to focus on some of the documentation from the debates that surfaced in the mid-80s around repartition. So this is to focus specifically on this document, and it's available. I think actually it's available from the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. If you go on, you can Google the particular reference number, TNA, which is the National Archive of the United Kingdom, Premier Prime Minister's Office, 19/1286. So while the British government under Thatcher never really considered repartition as a viable policy, and this is irrespective of Thatcher's, if you like, personal superficial interest in the topic, the subject was at least examined at the highest level during Thatcher's second term in office in 1983 to 1987. And again, context is important here. When Thatcher wins that extraordinary overall majority in 1983, she manages to wipe out the Ted Heath supporters within her cabinet. She now has a stranglehold over her own cabinet and now has a stranglehold over policy. She decides that she wants to do something about Ireland. That's a quote from Thatcher, because she is pained by the huge loss of life, particularly the loss of life of British personnel. And the question she poses to herself at the time is, all of these young men, and they were predominantly young men, went and fought in the Falklands, and some died, and a huge outcry of public emotion. There wasn't a similar outcry of public emotion when soldiers lost their lives in Northern Ireland. And she wanted to kind of address that issue, that grievance. And again, so for Thatcher, it was about security, it was about her own troops. It wasn't about the political aspirations of unionists or nationalists. And actually on that point, which again, which struck me, although I've labelled Thatcher a unionist, it's extraordinary how much Thatcher disliked us unionist politicians of the day. She had no time for James Monlew. She had absolutely no time for the Reverend Ian Paisley. And they were meant to be unionists on her side. Now, I would also make the point she had no time for an Irish nationalist, be it John Hume and the SDLP or the Irish government. She didn't mind Gareth Fitzgerald. She had a kind of, I don't know how you describe it, it was a kindred of spirits with Fitzgerald, but she completely despised Charles J. Haughey. And I've written about that in my previous works, particularly over Haughey's antics at the 1980 Anglo-Irish meeting. But again, that's something we can discuss if people are interested after the paper concludes. So declassified British government files from 1984 revealed that Thatcher, together with some of her most senior ministerial colleagues, including Sir Geoffrey Howe, who I mentioned, James Pryor, debated the merits of repartition and potential changes to the boundary of Northern Ireland. Their interests stemmed from a briefing paper produced on behalf of the Northern Ireland Office, which was responsible for policy development in relation to the North. And it was produced in conjunction with research conducted by Dr. Paul Compton of Queen's University, Belfast. And here is an extract from that specific paper. Dated the 6th of June 1984, the paper raised the prospect of, quote, the boundary between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, now redrawing the boundary between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, now in a way which would produce a more homogeneous population in Northern Ireland, and to examine the scope for redrawing the boundary in a way which would achieve the significant reduction in the size of the minority, and of course that's the Catholic minority. So it's engineering of population, something which happened, of course, with the introduction of the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, when the state of Northern Ireland was created, where 3 counties of Ulster were removed, and then overnight you had the creation of this, if you like, artificial entity, which was Northern Ireland, if you would argue that from that perspective. What's really interesting about this extract is that the most radical proposal contained within the paper, and it's up here on your screen, was a suggestion to reduce the population in Northern Ireland to just over 1 million, of which 73.5% would be Protestant and 26.5% Roman Catholic. Now, this quote from the document, radical redrawing of the border, would just involve ceding more than half of the present area of Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland. And the paper also suggested, extraordinarily, ceding most of the city of Derry to the Republic of Ireland and effectively establishing a walled ghetto in West Belfast. Now, in the final analysis, the paper was rejected by Thatcher's cabinet. And I don't want to, some historians have a tendency, if you like, to find one document in an archive and to jump on it and then to make that the only document that was discussed and make it the center of their argument. I'm more realistic to appreciate that this is one document of hundreds, if not thousands. But nonetheless, it was a document that was discussed by Thatcher. So she considered it. And I've already proven that she brought up this idea of repartition continuously throughout her premiership. But at the same time, as I said, I don't want to oversell it. But in the final analysis, the paper rejected the prospect of redrawing the Northern Ireland boundary, a stance that Thatcher and her ministerial colleagues approved. Quote, and this is from the document in question, whereas moving 500,000 people might be the obvious solution for a totalitarian regime, a note here to the Soviet Union, of course, the paper concluded, quote, we face problems as regard the spirit and letter of human rights provisions and international opinion. And what's really interesting, you'll see under PowerPoint here, it's underlined. Well, Thatcher herself underlined that in red. And usually when Thatcher underlined something with a straight red line, it meant her approval. When you look at her personal papers, when she has a little squiggly red line, that means her disapproval. So indeed, at a meeting attended by the cabinet, including Thatcher, Howe and James Pryor in 1984, it was collectively agreed by those present that, quote, repartition did not offer a way forward, end quote. So what does this tell us about Thatcher and Northern Ireland? Just to conclude my point for this evening. Well, how do we describe Thatcher's legacy in Northern Ireland? And I think by looking at the question of repartition, it's quite telling. In truth, Northern Ireland rarely featured high on her list of political priorities, and nor was it a topic which he truly ever understood. And I think the question of repartition demonstrates that. Deep down, she resented having to commit so much of her energy and time to a subject and was impatient with a situation which did not easily lend itself to a rational solution. On the occasions when Northern Ireland was forced to the top of her agenda, and this was security considerations, not political factors, they determined her stance. But during her premiership, Thatcher occasionally raised the prospect of repartition and the redrawing of the boundary of Northern Ireland, including, as we've noted, the mass transfer of Catholics to the Republic of Ireland. This was a vivid example, if you like, of her naivety on the subject. Despite repeated utterances from prominent Whitehall officials and her ministerial colleagues alike, such a policy might lend to full-scale civil war in Northern Ireland, Thatcher at least continued to debate the merits of repartition, particularly during her second period as British Prime Minister. And in conclusion, I would therefore suggest that Thatcher's occasional support for the potential redrawing of the boundary of Northern Ireland was conditioned by her misguided belief that such a policy would invariably improve cross-border security along the Irish border and as a result diminish the threat posed by Irish Republican paramilitaries. So in the final analysis, I would propose that Thatcher's legacy in Northern Ireland is associated with political naivety, frustration and a sense of hopelessness. Thank you all.
And thanks, Stephen. That was fantastic. That was very insightful. A great summary of Margaret Thatcher and that particular time period in Ireland. I have a number of questions. I hope you don't mind taking them. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box. I have a question here from Stephen McCracken. How big an influence did the Brighton bombing have on Thatcher and her commitment to Northern Ireland? This is often seen as a turning point, and is this reflected in her writings and her mannerisms?
That's a really important question. And I would have argued before I conducted the research around the Brighton bombing, so that was October 1984, that it surely had a deep impact in terms of transforming her ideas around the issue of allowing the Irish government a consultative role in Northern Ireland. But what's striking is on the eve of the Brighton bombing, Thatcher had already authorised Lord Armstrong, who was her private cabinet secretary, to hold top secret negotiations with Dermot Nally, who was the cabinet secretary in the Irish government. And before the bombing had happened, she had already officially, but not publicly, acknowledged that the Irish government would have a consultative role in the affairs of Northern Ireland. But saying that, the day after the Brighton bombing, she did write to Charles Powell, her private secretary for foreign affairs, seeking to call a halt to those talks. They were known as the Armstrong-Nally talks because of what had happened. But Powell and others around her, particularly William Whitehall, who was our de facto prime minister, convinced Thatcher to go ahead with the negotiations, which eventually led a year later to the talks. Now, a footnote to that is, I think it was Patrick McCabe, so I mightn't got his name correct, but the person who was convicted for the Brighton bombing, he was put in prison, but Thatcher was absolutely disgusted under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement that he was released as part of the political process of releasing political prisoners. So that was something that she could never forgive Mo Mowlam for. And in her personal papers, she wrote a letter to Mo Mowlam condemning her for that decision in particular. So yeah, that's, I hope that answers your question.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Stephen. I have another one here from Matthew Lynn. He's obviously studying this period, so he said, fantastic talk, learned a lot that will help with my dissertation. Right. I was wondering, did Douglas Hogg have much disagreement with Thatcher on other Irish issues?
I'm not sure. I need to consult my research, but nothing stands out. But what I'd say, if it's Patrick, I'd be more than happy, Patrick, if you wanted to email me after this and we could have an email conversation. I'd be more than happy to give you some advice on your dissertation. But I don't know off the top of my head if that's the case. So if you'd like to email me, you'll find my details on my Liverpool Hope website.
Very good. I won myself, and you alluded to it in the lecture, Stephen. You discussed Margaret's disgust, I think you said, with Charles Haughey. And Can you expand on that further? Because I'd be very interested to see hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I've always been fascinated by Charles J. Haughey. My previous book in 2016 was called A Failed Political Entity. It was Charles Haughey and the Northern Ireland question. And as part of that research, I got to interview many people who would have been contemporaries of Charlie Haughey, those who work closely from a political perspective, and also those in the media, and civil servants. And what's striking is when Charles Haughey becomes Taoiseach in 1979, he really is committed to doing something about the North. And for him, Northern Ireland, to use his own phrase, is a failed political entity. So there's no point looking for an internal solution. He argues that you need to have a Dublin-London relationship, which will, go over the heads of us unionists. And what's actually interesting is initially Thatcher was quite susceptible to that argument. And I think it was Robert Armstrong again said when they first met one another for their first Anglo-Irish summit in 1980, there was a glint apparently in Charlie Haughey's eye, which Thatcher found attractive. So I don't know if there was a physical attraction or an emotional attraction or an intellectual attraction, and they got along really well. And then the problem was with Charlie Haughey, because he was such a political opportunist and he tried to sell everything. When they next met in London in May of 1980, he brought with him a silver teapot. I think it was, if anyone's watched the TV series Haughey, I think there's a part related to that. But anyway, after presenting Maggie with this teapot, which she thought was very nice, Haughey then went out to the media saying that Northern Ireland's constitutional position was up for grabs. And the reality was Northern Ireland's constitutional position was never discussed at that meeting. But again, Haughey couldn't help himself. He lost the run of himself. And Brian Lennon didn't help matters. He was Charlie Haughey's Minister for Foreign Affairs, because he then went on to BBC radio and told everyone that Northern Ireland would be part of Ireland within 10 years. So that drove Maggie around the bend, and that's a quote from Dermot Nally. And then the big issue, of course, was in 1982, because Charlie Haughey initially agreed to enact sanctions against the Argentinians for their actions of invading the Falklands. But then the Irish government withdrew their support for sanctions. And that was when the moment where that relationship completely severed. And Thatcher refused thereafter to even be in the room with Charlie Haughey for more than 10 minutes if she could. She never had another formal summit meeting with Charlie Haughey, even though he was Taoiseach into the late 80s and early 90s.
Thanks, Stephen. Great answer. I have another one here from Padraig O'Brien. He's asking how much different was Labour policy in terms of their stance on Northern Ireland versus Margaret Thatcher? Was there kind of a common UK approach, or was she specifically different?
Yeah, she was different. She was very much so. So in the 1970s, there was a bipartisan policy between the Labour Party under Ted Heath and the Labour Party under Harold Wilson and later Callaghan, and the Conservative Party under Ted Heath. And what's very evident is when Thatcher's elected as Prime Minister, as Conservative Party leader in 1975, when she appoints Airey Neave as her spokesman for Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, so the oppositional spokesperson, things start to radically change, because Airey Neave in the late 70s starts to talk about no longer supporting a devolved government based on shared partnership. Rather, he's talking about single model partnership, single model, so majority rule. So the writing was on the wall, really. And also Airey Neave in the late 70s is talking about destroying the Republican movement. And it's no coincidence that the day the election was called in 1979, Airey Neave was signalled out as a prime target by the INLA, because they feared once he came to power that the Labour government's policy would be thrown out the window of conciliatory politics. And that's actually what kind of happens with Thatcher. She, when she becomes Prime Minister, she initially drops the support for power sharing. That was the word I was looking for, power sharing, and favours majority rule. And again, that goes against everything that the Labour governments of the 70s and the Conservative Party of that period had supported, which of course was symbolised with the Sunningdale Agreement of 1973. So they're poles apart. But what's interesting is by the mid-80s, Thatcher does become much more receptive to Irish nationalists, something that the Labour government had been calling for. And when the Anglo-Irish Anglo-Irish Agreement is signed in 1985, she gets overwhelming support from the Labour Party, with the exception of a couple of renegade Labour Party MPs. And I'd ask anyone, does anyone know who might be the radical Labour MP who refused to support the Sunningdale or the Anglo-Irish Agreement? Anyone? I know you probably can't put in the chat there, but it was Jeremy Corbyn. He opposed the Anglo-Irish Agreement, as did Sinn Féin actually at the time.
Okay, very interesting. I have a question from Liam Shortall. Was there any attempt at all by her government to see if the Irish government might be open to the idea of repartition as a solution to the troubles?
The answer is no, not that I'm aware of. Thatcher, the furthest she was willing to go was to concede that consultative role, whereby the Irish were able to establish a presence in the north through a secretary. But for Thatcher, you can't forget that her rock was sovereignty, to use Robert Armstrong's description. So in no way did she wish to dilute Britain's sovereignty over Northern Ireland, or to give up parts of Northern Ireland to facilitate, well, arguably she was willing to facilitate some transfer of Catholics across the border, but she wasn't willing to dilute Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom. Something, of course, which Conservative policy leaders, certain Conservative Party leaders, Prime Ministers more recently have been quite willing to do. Okay,
great answer. Thank you. I've one for myself that I jotted down, and I get this in before the end. Thank you so much, Stephen. Was Thatcher's reputation as the Iron Lady due to, as you have outlined, her unionist perspective on the UK, or was it part of her personality, so part of her personal trait? So she had this reputation as being totally uncompromising, coal miners, hunger strikers. You know, she had this iron lady reputation. Was that personal, or was it more policy?
Yeah, again, that's a really interesting question, and opens up a debate around how you define Thatcher and her legacy. So the word originally, or this description of the Iron Lady was meant to be derogatory, and it was used by the Soviets in the press release. But actually, Thatcher embraced the idea of being called the Iron Lady, which obviously the name was taken from Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, the German Chancellor. Was she an Iron Lady in terms of personality? Absolutely. What we shouldn't forget, look, even if you don't like Thatcher's policies, and I'll be honest, it wouldn't be my cup of tea, you have to admire the fact that that lady became not only leader of the Conservative Party, but British Prime Minister. She was the first female Prime Minister in the Western world. How she became the leader of the Conservative Party, she came from a middle class background, the daughter of a grocer. She didn't come from the higher echelons of British society, which the vast majority of her predecessors would have, with the exception maybe of Ted Heath. She was a woman, so her sex, her class went against her. But the fact that she was able to get the power has to kind of demonstrate that she had this inner, core of strength. And when it comes to her reputation in terms of the Iron Lady, yes, you mentioned the Falklands. Her ability to defeat trade unionism, and she did defeat trade unionism. She forced them back to work again. We have to acknowledge that strength, even if we don't necessarily agree with the policies, and her role on the international world stage. What struck me when I read Charles Moore's biography, I couldn't believe she was an icon when she went and visited the Soviet Union. She was mobbed by people. This is the mid to mid late 80s. People were commentating on her type of fashion, her hair. Her performance in the media. She was like a Hollywood superstar. And, that kind of fed into this idea that she was a figure of strength on the world stage. And let's not forget, Britain at that time was a laughingstock. The IMF had been called in effectively in the late 70s. Britain was on its knees. So she did internationally rehabilitate the British idea of its self-worth, irrespective, if you like, of the charade of the Falklands. But that certainly worked in our favour.
Great, Stephen, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. I have one final question. Where can people buy your book? Would you like to tell us?
Yeah, well, you might see a strategically placed it behind me here.
We've noticed it there.
Shameless self-publicity. What I'd say is to everyone, I wouldn't recommend you buy the book right away, because it's come out as an academic publication, so it's been sold at the moment for £80 sterling. Which is, a price myself I wouldn't agree with. It's coming out next year in softback, and it will be available from Bloomsbury, Bloomsbury, excuse me, my press, and also on Amazon. So if you are interested, maybe wait for the soft back version to come out, which hopefully will sell for about 20 to 30 pound. But yeah, look, I'm really appreciative of you coming along this evening, and I really enjoyed having a conversation with you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. It was very informative. Again, I said this to so many lectures. I'm learning so much history in the last 12 months. Thanks so much for taking up the offer. Thanks so much for joining us. I think we've all really enjoyed the evening, and you can tell that by the level of engagement and the questions at the end.
Thanks.
So listen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Liam. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.